The sun was setting over Willowbrook Heights, painting the sky in soft orange and pink colors. This was the kind of neighborhood where every lawn looked perfect, where expensive cars sat in driveways, and where people knew each other by name. It was Tuesday evening, and the community center was hosting its monthly safety meeting. Margaret Henderson had lived in Willowbrook Heights for 15 years. She loved everything about her neighborhood, the quiet streets, the well-maintained parks, and most of all, the sense of security it gave her. At 45, Margaret worked part-time at a local bank and spent her free time volunteering at the community center. She took pride in being what she called a watchful neighbor. That evening, Margaret was leaving the community center after helping set up chairs for the meeting when she noticed someone sitting on the bench outside. It was a young black teenager, maybe 16 years old, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. He had a backpack beside him and was quietly reading what looked like a textbook. At first, Margaret didn't think much of it. But as she walked to her car, something bothered her. She had never seen this boy before, and she knew most of the families in the area. He looked out of place, she thought to herself. What was he doing here at this time of evening? Margaret got into her silver Honda and sat there for a moment, watching the teenager through her windshield. He was still reading, occasionally looking up at his phone. There was something about the way he kept glancing around that made her uncomfortable. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After sitting in her car for about 10 minutes, Margaret decided she needed to do something. She was known in the neighborhood for being friendly and helpful, so she thought maybe she should just go talk to him, find out what he was doing there. After all, it was getting dark, and this was a safe neighborhood where people looked out for each other. Margaret walked back toward the bench, her heels clicking on the concrete. The teenager looked up as she approached, giving her a polite nod and a small smile. "Excuse me," Margaret said, trying to sound friendly but firm. "I haven't seen you around here before. Are you waiting for someone?" The teenager closed his book and looked up at her. "Yes, ma'am, I'm waiting for my mom. She's in a meeting inside." "A meeting?" Margaret's eyebrows went up. "What kind of meeting? Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" The young man looked a bit confused by her question. "Yes, ma'am. She told me to wait out here because the meeting might run late. She didn't want me sitting inside the whole time." Margaret felt her suspicion growing. Something about his story didn't add up to her. Why would someone bring their teenager to a community meeting and then leave him outside? It seemed strange, even suspicious. "Well, what's your mother's name?" "Maybe I know her. I volunteer here all the time." The teenager hesitated for a moment. He seemed uncomfortable with all the questions, but he answered politely. "Her name is Dr. Williams. She's new to the area." Margaret had never heard of any Dr. Williams in their neighborhood. This made her even more suspicious. "Dr. Williams? I don't know any Dr. Williams around here." "Are you sure you have the right place?" "Yes, ma'am. This is definitely the right place." She showed me the address before she went inside. Margaret studied the young man's face. He seemed nervous now, which only confirmed her suspicions. Why would he be nervous if he was telling the truth? "What's in your backpack?" she asked suddenly. The teenager looked surprised by the question. "Just my school stuff. Books, notebooks. My camera for a project." "A camera?" Margaret's voice got sharper. "What kind of project requires a camera at a community center?" "It's for my architecture class. We're supposed to take pictures of different building styles around the city. This building has some interesting features." Now Margaret was really worried. Taking pictures of buildings? That sounded exactly like what someone would do if they were planning something bad. She had seen enough news stories to know that people sometimes took photos of places before they did terrible things. "You were taking pictures of this building?" she demanded. "Just a few for my homework. The design is really unique, especially the way the columns—" "That's enough," Margaret interrupted. "I think you need to leave. This is a private community center, and you don't belong here." The teenager's face showed hurt and confusion. "Ma'am, I'm just waiting for my mother. She really is inside. Maybe if you could ask someone." "I don't need to ask anyone anything. I can see what's going on here. You're making people uncomfortable, taking pictures, asking questions. I think you should go before there's any trouble." Other people were starting to notice the conversation. A few residents walking by slowed down to see what was happening. Margaret felt more confident now that she had an audience. She was protecting her neighborhood, doing what any responsible citizen would do. The teenager stood up from the bench, his book and backpack in his hands. "Please, ma'am, I don't want any trouble. I'm just waiting for my mom. She'll be out soon." But Margaret had made up her mind. The boy's nervousness, the camera, the fact that she had never seen him before, it all added up to something suspicious in her mind. She thought about all the news stories she had seen, all the warnings about being vigilant, about reporting suspicious activity. "I'm going to call the police," she announced loudly enough for the other people nearby to hear. "There's something not right about this situation." The teenager's eyes went wide. "Ma'am, please don't do that. I haven't done anything wrong. If you just wait a few more minutes, my mom will come out and explain everything." But Margaret was already walking back to her car, pulling out her cell phone. She felt like she was doing the right thing, protecting her community. She dialed 911 and waited for someone to answer. 911, "What's your emergency?" "I need to report suspicious activity at the Willowbrook Heights Community Center. There's a young man here who doesn't belong, and he's been taking pictures of the building. I think he might be planning something. Can you describe the suspicious activity in more detail?" Margaret looked back at the teenager, who was now standing by the bench looking scared and confused. He's a black male, about 16, wearing a gray hoodie. He claims he's waiting for his mother, but I've never seen him before, and his story doesn't make sense. He has a camera and has been taking pictures of our community center. He seems nervous and suspicious. Are there any weapons visible? Is anyone in immediate danger? I don't see any weapons, but you never know these days. He has a backpack and he could have anything in there. I just think someone should check him out before something bad happens. Officers are on their way. Please, stay in a safe location and don't approach the individual." Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction as she hung up the phone. She was doing her civic duty, keeping her neighborhood safe. She stayed in her car and watched the teenager, who was now pacing nervously by the bench, occasionally looking toward the community center doors as if hoping someone would come out. Within minutes, she could see the flashing lights of police cars turning onto their street. Margaret felt vindicated. The authorities would handle this properly, and her neighborhood would remain safe. She had no idea that in the next few minutes everything she thought she knew about this situation was about to change completely. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the evening air as two police cars pulled up to the Willowbrook Heights Community Center. The first car stopped right in front of the building, while the second parked a little further down the street. The sound of car doors slamming echoed in the quiet neighborhood. Officer Rodriguez stepped out of the first car. He was a veteran cop with 20 years on the force, someone who had seen enough situations to know that things weren't always what they seemed. His partner, Officer Chun, was younger but equally experienced in handling community calls. They had worked together for 3 years and had developed a good understanding of how to approach these kinds of situations. Margaret immediately got out of her Honda and hurried toward the officers, her heels clicking rapidly on the pavement. She was excited and nervous at the same time, feeling important that she had been the one to spot the suspicious activity. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she said breathlessly as she reached them. "I'm the one who called. I'm Margaret Henderson, and I live just 2 blocks from here. I volunteer at this community center all the time." Officer Rodriguez nodded politely. "Ma'am, can you tell us exactly what you observed?" Margaret pointed toward the teenager, who was still standing by the bench, now looking very worried as he watched the police approach. That young man over there has been hanging around for over an hour. He doesn't belong in this neighborhood. I've lived here for 15 years, and I've never seen him before. Officer Chun looked toward the teenager, then back at Margaret. Did you see him doing anything illegal? Well, not exactly illegal, but definitely suspicious. He was taking pictures of our building with his phone. And when I asked him what he was doing, his story kept changing. First he said he was waiting for someone. Then he said it was for some school project. It just didn't add up. The two officers exchanged a quick glance. They had handled dozens of calls like this over the years. Sometimes there really was suspicious activity, but often it was just misunderstandings or people being overly cautious about anyone who looked different or out of place. Did he threaten you in any way? Officer Rodriguez asked. No, but he seemed nervous when I questioned him. And you know how things are these days. You can't be too careful. What if he's planning something? What if he's here to case the building for a break-in or something worse? Officer Chun nodded. We understand your concern, ma'am. We'll go talk to him and see what's going on. Please stay here while we handle this. The two officers walked toward the teenager, who was now clearly anxious as he watched them approach. His hands were shaking slightly, and he kept looking toward the community center doors, as if hoping someone would come out to help him. By now, several other people had noticed the commotion. A jogger had stopped across the street and was pretending to stretch while watching the scene unfold. An elderly man walking his dog had paused near the sidewalk. A woman pushing a stroller had slowed down to see what was happening. Word was starting to spread through the neighborhood that something was going on at the community center. Good evening, Officer Rodriguez said as he approached the teenager. His voice was calm and professional. We received a call about some concerns in this area. Can I ask what you're doing here tonight? The teenager took a deep breath before answering. Good evening, officer. I'm waiting for my mother. She's inside the community center attending a meeting. What's your name, son? Tyler. Williams, sir. Officer Chun pulled out a small notebook. How long have you been waiting here, Tyler? About an hour and a half, maybe a little more. The meeting was supposed to end at 7, but it's running late. Officer Rodriguez looked at his watch. It was almost 8 o'clock. That's quite a long time to wait outside. Why didn't you go inside with your mother? Tyler shifted his weight from one foot to the other. She said the meeting might be boring for me, and she didn't want me to have to sit through the whole thing. So she asked me to wait out here and do some homework. Can I see some identification? Officer Chun asked gently. Tyler nodded and carefully pulled out his wallet, extracting his school ID card. The officers examined it closely. It showed his name, photo, and the name of Roosevelt High School, which was about 15 minutes away from the community center. Roosevelt High, huh? Officer Rodriguez said. That's a good school. What grade are you in? 11th grade, sir. I'm in the honors program. Margaret, who had been watching from a distance, couldn't contain herself any longer. She walked closer to the officers, speaking loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Officers, don't let him fool you with that innocent act. I saw him taking pictures of the building. He was being very secretive about it, looking around to see if anyone was watching. That's not normal behavior for someone just waiting for their mother. Tyler's face flushed with embarrassment. Ma'am, I can explain about the pictures. It's for a school project. Officer Chun turned to Tyler. Can you tell us about this project? Tyler pulled his backpack around to the front and carefully unzipped it. I'm taking an architecture class, and we have to document different building styles around the city. Our teacher wants us to take photos and write about the design elements we notice. He pulled out a spiral notebook that was filled with handwritten notes and sketches. The pages showed drawings of various buildings with detailed notes about columns, windows, and architectural features. Officer Rodriguez flipped through a few pages of the notebook. "This looks like pretty detailed work." "Yes, sir. Our teacher is really strict about the project. We have to visit at least 10 different buildings and analyze their architectural styles. This community center has some really interesting art deco features that I wanted to document. Can we see the photos you took?" Officer Chun asked. Tyler nodded and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his recent photos, showing the officers several pictures of the community center's exterior. The photos focused on architectural details like the decorative stonework, the curved windows, and the geometric patterns above the entrance. Officer Rodriguez studied the photos. They were clearly the work of a student focusing on building design, not someone trying to case a location for criminal activity. The angles were artistic, highlighting interesting architectural features rather than security cameras or entry points. Meanwhile, Margaret was growing more frustrated as she watched the officers calmly examining Tyler's school materials. This wasn't going the way she had expected. She had thought they would immediately see how suspicious he was and take action. "Officers," she said, her voice getting louder, "you're not taking this seriously enough. I don't care what kind of story he has or what school ID he shows you. The fact is, he doesn't belong in this neighborhood. I've never seen him before, and neither has anyone else here." A small crowd had gathered by now. The jogger had crossed the street and was openly watching. The elderly man with the dog had moved closer. Several residents had come out of their houses to see what was happening. Some were taking photos and videos with their phones. Officer Chun looked around at the growing crowd and realized the situation was becoming more complicated than a simple welfare check. "Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but this young man has provided identification and a reasonable explanation for his presence here. He hasn't violated any laws." "But what about the pictures? What about the fact that he's been lurking around our community center for hours?" Tyler spoke up, his voice slightly shaky but determined. "Officers, I wasn't lurking. I was sitting on this public bench waiting for my mother. I was reading my history textbook and working on homework. I only took a few pictures for my school project." Margaret shook her head vigorously. "That's what he says, but how do we know it's true? How do we know this isn't some kind of cover story? These days, you can't trust anyone. Young people are capable of terrible things." Officer Rodriguez felt the tension in the air. He had been doing this job long enough to recognize when a situation was about to escalate. The crowd was getting bigger, phones were recording, and emotions were running high. "Tyler," he said, "is there a way we can contact your mother to verify that she's inside the building?" Tyler's face lit up with relief. "Yes, sir. I have her phone number. But she might not answer because she's in the meeting. Maybe someone inside could get her." Just as Officer Chun was about to respond, they all heard the sound of the community center doors opening. Several people began walking out, their meeting apparently finished. Tyler immediately looked hopeful, scanning the faces of the people emerging from the building. "That might be her," he said, pointing toward the doors. "My mom should be coming out any minute now." Margaret watched nervously as more people exited the building. She was beginning to have a sinking feeling that maybe, just maybe, she had made a terrible mistake. The community center doors swung open wider, and more people began streaming out into the evening air. It had clearly been a well-attended meeting, with at least 30 people now making their way down the front steps. Some were chatting in small groups, others were checking their phones, and a few were already heading toward their cars in the parking lot. Tyler stood on his tiptoes, scanning the faces of everyone coming out. His heart was beating fast, and he felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief because his mother would finally be able to explain everything, but anxiety because he knew she would not be happy about what had happened. The crowd of onlookers had grown even larger. Word was spreading quickly through social media, and more neighbors were arriving to see what was happening at their usually quiet community center. Some were taking photos and videos, while others were whispering among themselves about what they thought was going on. Margaret stood near the police officers, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. She was starting to feel a knot forming in her stomach, but she tried to push away any doubts about her actions. She had done the right thing, she told herself. Better to be safe than sorry. Even if this turned out to be a misunderstanding, at least she had been vigilant and protective of her neighborhood. Officer Rodriguez was keeping a close eye on the growing crowd, while Officer Chun continued to observe Tyler's reactions. The teenager seemed genuinely relieved that people were coming out of the building, which was a good sign that his story was probably true. "There she is," Tyler suddenly called out, his voice filled with relief. "Mom, over here." Everyone turned to look in the direction Tyler was pointing. Walking down the steps was a woman in her early 40s, wearing a sharp navy blue business suit and carrying a leather briefcase. She moved with confidence and purpose, the kind of walk that suggested she was used to being in charge of situations. Dr. Angela Williams had been in meetings like this one many times before. As someone who worked in law enforcement at the highest levels, she was often called upon to speak at community safety meetings, neighborhood watch programs, and local government forums. Tonight's meeting had been about building better relationships between law enforcement and the community, which made what was happening outside particularly ironic. When Dr. Williams first spotted the police cars and the crowd, she felt a moment of confusion. But when she saw her son Tyler standing next to two police officers, with a crowd of people watching and recording, her professional instincts immediately kicked in. Something was very wrong here. She quickened her pace as she approached the group, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. Tyler looked scared and embarrassed. The police officers appeared to be handling the situation professionally, but she could see the tension in their posture. And there was a middle-aged white woman standing nearby who seemed to be very agitated about something. "Tyler," she said as she reached them, her voice calm but with an underlying current of concern. "What's going on here?" "Mom, I'm so glad you're here," Tyler said, his voice shaking slightly. "This lady called the police on me. She said I was being suspicious because I was waiting for you and taking pictures for my school project." Dr. Williams's expression didn't change, but those who knew her well would have recognized the slight tightening around her eyes. That meant she was processing information quickly and not liking what she was hearing. She turned to Officer Rodriguez, extending her hand in a professional greeting. "Good evening, officers. I'm Dr. Williams, and this is my son Tyler. May I ask what seems to be the problem?" Officer Rodriguez shook her hand, immediately noticing something familiar about her bearing and the way she spoke. There was an unmistakable air of authority about this woman that suggested she was more than just a concerned parent. "Ma'am, we received a call about suspicious activity. A resident was concerned about your son's presence in the area and reported that he was taking photographs of the building." Dr. Williams nodded slowly, her professional mind already understanding the full implications of what had happened. "I see. And may I ask which resident made this complaint?" Margaret stepped forward, still convinced that she had done the right thing, even though she was beginning to feel less certain than she had an hour ago. "I did. I'm Margaret Henderson, and I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. I volunteer at this community center regularly, and I've never seen your son before. He was acting suspicious, taking pictures, and his story didn't make sense." Dr. Williams turned to face Margaret directly, her gaze steady and measuring. "What exactly did you find suspicious about a teenager sitting on a public bench reading a book?" Margaret felt herself getting defensive. It wasn't just that he was sitting there. He was taking pictures of our building, and when I questioned him, he seemed nervous. "These days you have to be careful. You never know what people are planning." "I see," Dr. Williams said quietly. "And what did you think my son might be planning?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret realized she had never actually articulated what she thought Tyler was planning to do. She had just had a vague sense that something was wrong, a feeling that had grown stronger the longer she watched him. "Well, I thought maybe he was casing the building. You know, taking pictures to plan a break-in or something worse. There have been incidents in other neighborhoods." Dr. Williams's expression remained neutral, but her voice carried a slight edge when she spoke again. "Officer, did you examine the photographs my son took?" Officer Chun nodded. "Yes, ma'am. They appear to be architectural photos focusing on design elements of the building. They're consistent with the school project." "And did you see his school identification and project materials?" "Yes, ma'am. Everything appeared to be legitimate." Dr. Williams turned back to Margaret. "So let me understand this correctly. You saw a black teenager sitting quietly on a public bench, reading a book and waiting for his mother. He was taking photographs of architectural features for a school project. When you questioned him, he politely explained what he was doing and mentioned that his mother was inside the building attending a meeting. And your response to this was to call the police and report him as suspicious?" Margaret felt the blood rushing to her face. When Dr. Williams laid it out like that, it sounded terrible. But she still felt like she had to defend her actions. "I was just being careful. I was protecting our community. I didn't know who he was or what he might be planning." "But you didn't think to simply wait and see if his mother actually came out of the building? You didn't think to go inside and ask if anyone knew about a Dr. Williams attending the meeting?" Margaret's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She hadn't thought of either of those options. She had jumped straight to calling the police. Officer Rodriguez was watching this exchange with growing interest. There was something about the way Dr. Williams was handling this situation that reminded him of interrogations he had witnessed in court. She wasn't raising her voice or showing anger, but she was systematically dismantling Margaret's justifications with surgical precision. "Ma'am," he said to Dr. Williams, "if you don't mind me asking, what kind of work do you do?" Dr. Williams reached into her suit jacket and pulled out a leather credential case. She opened it and displayed her badge and identification card. "I'm FBI Director Angela Williams," she said simply. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Officer Rodriguez's eyes widened, and Officer Chun straightened up noticeably. Both officers had heard of Director Williams. She was a well-known figure in law enforcement circles, someone who had worked her way up through the ranks and was respected throughout the country. Margaret's face went completely white. She felt like the ground was falling away beneath her feet. She had called the police on the FBI director's son. The FBI director, who had been inside the community center attending a meeting about community safety and police relations. The crowd that had gathered was close enough to hear the conversation, and a murmur went through the group as people realized what had just been revealed. Phones were held higher as people tried to capture this moment, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Tyler looked at his mother with a mixture of pride and concern. He was proud that she was there to defend him, but he was also worried about how this whole situation might affect her professionally. He knew how hard she had worked to get where she was, and he didn't want his problems to create problems for her. Dr. Williams closed her credential case and put it back in her jacket. "Officers, I appreciate how professionally you've handled this situation. I know these calls can be difficult, and you've been respectful and thorough in your approach." "Officer." Rodriguez found his voice. "Thank you, Director Williams. We're sorry for any inconvenience this has caused you and your son. No need to apologize, officer. You were doing your job. You responded to a citizen's call and investigated appropriately." She paused and looked directly at Margaret. "The question now is what we all learn from this experience." Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she had done, not just to Tyler and his mother, but to herself and her community. She had let fear and prejudice drive her actions, and now she was standing face to face with the consequences. The silence that followed Dr. Williams's revelation seemed to stretch on forever. Margaret stood frozen, staring at the FBI credentials that had just been shown to her. Her mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. She had called the police on the son of one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. Officer Rodriguez cleared his throat, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Director Williams, we had no idea. We're truly sorry about this situation. Dr. Williams nodded gracefully, her professional composure never wavering despite what had to be intense personal feelings about seeing her son treated this way. Officers, you handled this call exactly as you should have. You were professional, respectful, and thorough. That's what good police work looks like. The crowd that had gathered was now completely silent, everyone straining to hear every word of this extraordinary conversation. Many people were still recording with their phones, understanding that they were witnessing something that would likely be talked about for years to come. In Willowbrook Heights, Tyler stood close to his mother, feeling a mixture of relief and embarrassment. He was glad that his mother was there to defend him, but he also felt bad that this situation had happened at all. He could see the pain in her eyes. Even though she was maintaining her professional demeanor, Dr. Williams turned to address the crowd that had gathered. I want everyone here to understand what happened tonight. My son Tyler is a 16-year-old honor student. He was waiting for me to finish a meeting inside this community center, a meeting, ironically, about building trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve. She paused, letting that irony sink in before continuing. Tyler was sitting on a public bench, reading a textbook, and working on a legitimate school project that required him to photograph architectural features of buildings around the city. He was polite when questioned. He provided identification when asked, and he explained his presence here clearly and honestly. Margaret felt like she was shrinking with every word Dr. Williams spoke. She wanted to disappear, to go back in time and handle the situation differently, but there was no escape from the reality of what she had done. Director Williams, Officer Chun said carefully, would you like us to file a report about this incident? Dr. Williams considered the question for a moment. Filing a report could create problems for Margaret, but it would also create an official record of what had happened. As an FBI director, she understood the importance of documentation, but as a mother, she was more concerned about protecting her son and teaching a lesson that might prevent this from happening to other families. I think that depends on what we all take away from this experience, she said thoughtfully. This isn't just about one person making a mistake. This is about the assumptions we make about people based on how they look, where we think they belong, and what we think they might be capable of. Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Director Williams, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I thought I was protecting our neighborhood. Dr. Williams looked at Margaret with an expression that was serious but not unkind. Mrs. Henderson, I believe you thought you were doing the right thing. But I need you to really think about why you felt my son was a threat. He was sitting quietly, reading a book, and taking photographs for a school project. Would you have called the police if he had been a white teenager doing exactly the same things? The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to say yes, of course she would have, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, she knew the answer was no. She wouldn't have given a second thought to a white teenager sitting on that bench. I don't know, Margaret admitted, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. I guess I was scared. But I don't understand why. Tyler never did anything threatening. Dr. Williams nodded. That's exactly the conversation we need to have. Why do we feel afraid of people who haven't done anything to hurt us? Why do we assume the worst about strangers based on their appearance? One of the people in the crowd, an elderly black man who had been watching silently, stepped forward. "Ma'am, if I may," he said to Dr. Williams. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 8 years, and I've had the police called on me 3 times. Once for checking my own mailbox, once for walking my dog in the evening, and once for sitting in my car outside my own house." Dr. Williams turned to face him. "Thank you for sharing that. It's important for everyone to hear these experiences." Margaret looked at the elderly man with shock. "Mr. Johnson? The police were called on you, but you live right down the street from me." "Yes, Mrs. Henderson, I do live right down the street. But apparently, some people think I don't belong here either." The weight of what was happening began to settle on the entire crowd. This wasn't just about one incident with Tyler. This was about a pattern of behavior that had been affecting multiple families in their neighborhood. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "As law enforcement officers, we respond to every call we receive. But we also want to encourage everyone to think carefully before making those calls. Ask yourself, is this person actually doing something illegal, or do they just look different from what I expected to see?" Dr. Williams appreciated the officer's words, but she knew that the real change had to come from the community itself. "I want everyone here to understand something important. My son Tyler has a 4.2 GPA. He volunteers at a local animal shelter. He's been accepted to 3 college summer programs. He's never been in trouble with the law, never been suspended from school, never even had a detention." She paused, looking around at all the faces in the crowd. But none of that mattered tonight. None of his achievements, none of his character, none of his good behavior mattered when someone decided he looked suspicious simply for existing in this space. Tyler finally spoke up, his voice stronger now that his mother was there to support him. "I was scared tonight. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I didn't know how to prove that I belonged here. I didn't know how to prove that I was just a regular kid doing homework and waiting for his mom." His words hit the crowd hard. Many of the adults present had teenagers of their own, and they couldn't imagine their children having to prove their right to exist in a public space. Margaret was crying openly now, understanding for the first time the real impact of her actions. "Tyler, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I made you feel that way. I'm sorry I called the police. I'm sorry I assumed the worst about you without even trying to get to know you." Dr. Williams watched Margaret's breakdown with a mixture of sadness and hope. Sadness for what her son had endured, but hope that maybe this painful experience could lead to real change and understanding. "Mrs. Henderson," she said gently, "I appreciate your apology. But the real question is, what are you going to do differently in the future? How are you going to challenge your own assumptions before they lead to situations like this?" Margaret wiped her eyes and looked directly at Tyler. "I want to do better. I want to learn from this. I don't ever want to make another person feel the way I made you feel tonight." The crowd began to murmur among themselves, processing everything they had witnessed. Some people were ashamed, recognizing their own biases in Margaret's actions. Others were angry about the injustice Tyler had faced. But most were simply trying to understand how their quiet neighborhood had become the site of such a powerful and uncomfortable lesson about prejudice and assumptions. Dr. Williams looked around at all the faces surrounding them, the police officers, the neighbors, the strangers who had stopped to watch. She saw an opportunity to turn this painful moment into something constructive. "What happened here tonight doesn't have to be the end of the story," she said to the crowd. "It can be the beginning of a conversation that this community needs to have. We can choose to learn from this, to do better, and to create a neighborhood where every family feels welcome and safe." Dr. Williams looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing an opportunity to transform this painful moment into something meaningful. The crowd had grown to include nearly 50 people now, drawn by the flashing police lights and the buzz. of social media posts about what was happening at the community center. "I know this has been uncomfortable for everyone," she began, her voice carrying the authority that had made her one of the youngest FBI directors in history, but also the warmth of a mother who wanted to protect not just her own son, but all children in the community. But discomfort is often where real learning begins. What happened here tonight is happening in communities across America every single day. The only difference is that my son was lucky enough to have a mother who could walk out of that building and change the dynamic of the situation. Margaret was still crying, but she was listening to every word. She had stopped trying to defend herself and was instead trying to understand how she had let fear override her common sense and basic human decency. Tyler stepped closer to his mother, drawing strength from her presence. "I want everyone to know that I'm not angry," he said, his voice carrying surprising maturity for a 16-year-old. "I'm hurt, and I was scared, but I'm not angry, because I think Mrs. Henderson really believed she was doing the right thing." Dr. Williams felt a surge of pride in her son. Even after being subjected to this humiliation, he was showing grace and understanding that many adults would struggle to demonstrate. "That's exactly right, Tyler," she said. "Mrs. Henderson wasn't acting out of malice. She was acting out of fear and assumptions that our society has taught her to make. The question is, how do we unlearn those assumptions?" Officer Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing this extraordinary scene, stepped forward. "Director Williams, in my 20 years of police work, I've responded to dozens of calls like this one. Usually they end with everyone going home frustrated and nothing really changing. But what you're doing here tonight, ... This is different. It's different because we're choosing to have an honest conversation instead of just walking away, Doctor," Williams replied. "Officer Chun, Officer Rodriguez, you both handled this situation professionally. You didn't assume Tyler was guilty of something just because someone called about him. You investigated, you asked questions, and you treated him with respect. That's how it should work." Officer Chun nodded. "We've had training about unconscious bias and community policing. But seeing it play out like this, with someone of your stature involved, it really drives the point home." Margaret wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "Director Williams, Tyler, I need you both to know that I understand what I did was wrong. Not just legally wrong, but morally wrong. I judged Tyler based on his skin color and my own fears, not on his actions." She turned to face the crowd that had gathered. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, and I've always thought of myself as a good person. I donate to charity, I volunteer at the community center, I help my neighbors. But tonight I learned that being a good person isn't enough if you're still carrying around prejudices that hurt other people." Dr. Williams nodded approvingly. "That's a hard truth to face, Mrs. Henderson, but recognizing it is the first step toward changing it." An older woman in the crowd spoke up. "I'm ashamed to admit this, but I probably would have done the same thing Margaret did. I would have seen Tyler sitting there and felt nervous, even though he wasn't doing anything wrong. What does that say about me?" "It says you're human," Dr. Williams answered. "We all carry biases that we've learned from our families, our communities, our media, and our experiences. The question isn't whether we have them, it's what we do once we become aware of them." Tyler looked around at all the adults who were now questioning their own assumptions and behaviors. "Can I say something?" he asked. Dr. Williams nodded, and Tyler stepped forward to address the crowd. "I know this has been hard for everyone tonight, but I want you all to know that this isn't the first time something like this has happened to me. It's just the first time it happened when my mom was around to see it." The crowd murmured with surprise and concern. Dr. Williams felt her heart break a little, knowing that her son had been dealing with these experiences without her knowledge. "Last month, I was stopped by security at the mall because they thought I shoplifted something," Tyler continued. "I hadn't taken anything, but they made me empty my pockets and my backpack in front of everyone. 2 weeks ago, a woman followed me around the grocery store because she thought I was going to steal something. These things happen all the time, Margaret gasped. Tyler, I had no idea. I'm so sorry that you've had to deal with that. The thing is, Tyler said, I've learned to expect it. When I go places, I always make sure to dress nicely, to speak politely, to keep my hands visible, to follow all these unwritten rules that other kids don't have to think about. But even when I do everything right, it still happens sometimes. Dr. Williams put her arm around her son's shoulders. And that's the reality that many families in America live with every day. The constant awareness that you might be seen as a threat simply for existing in certain spaces. Mr. Johnson, the elderly man who had spoken earlier, nodded sadly. Tyler, I've been dealing with this for 70 years, and I'm sorry to say it hasn't gotten as much better as I hoped it would. By now, but nights like tonight give me hope that maybe your generation will finally be the one to change things. Officer Rodriguez looked at his watch and realized they had been at the scene for over an hour. Director Williams, is there anything else you need from us tonight? Dr. Williams considered the question. Actually, yes. I'd like you both to know that this incident is going to stay with me. Not in a negative way, but as a reminder of why the work we do in law enforcement matters. Building trust with communities means responding to situations like this with professionalism and respect, which you both did. We appreciate that, Director, Officer Chun said. And if it's okay with you, we'd like to use this experience in our training programs. Not naming names or showing video, but talking about how these situations can be handled better. I think that's an excellent idea, Dr. Williams agreed. Margaret stepped forward hesitantly. Director Williams, Tyler, I know I don't have any right to ask this, but is there anything I can do to make this right? Any way I can help make sure this doesn't happen to other families? Dr. Williams studied Margaret's face, seeing genuine remorse and a desire to do better. Mrs. Henderson, the best thing you can do is exactly what you're doing right now. Acknowledge what happened, learn from it, and commit to doing better in the future. But is that enough? Margaret asked. I feel like I should do something more concrete, something that actually helps. Tyler surprised everyone by speaking up. Maybe you could help organize community events where people actually get to know each other, like block parties or neighborhood cookouts. It's harder to be afraid of people when you actually know them. Dr. Williams smiled at her son's wisdom. That's a wonderful idea, Tyler. Mrs. Henderson, if you're serious about making amends, maybe you could work with the community center to organize events that bring people together across racial and cultural lines. Margaret nodded eagerly. Yes, I would love to do that. I want to turn this mistake into something positive. As the crowd began to slowly disperse, many people approached Tyler and Dr. Williams to apologize for what had happened and to express their support. Others spoke quietly with Margaret, offering to help her organize the community events she had committed to planning. Dr. Williams and Tyler finally walked toward their car, both emotionally drained, but also somehow hopeful about what had transpired. Mom, Tyler said as they reached the car, do you think tonight will actually change anything? Dr. Williams looked back at the community center, where small groups of neighbors were still talking about what they had witnessed. I think it already has, Tyler. Real change happens one conversation at a time, one person at a time, one community at a time. And tonight, this community had a conversation it desperately needed to have. 3 months later, Margaret organized the first annual Willowbrook Heights Community Unity Festival. Tyler was the guest speaker, and his mother gave a presentation about building stronger police-community relationships. The festival became an annual tradition, and slowly but surely, the neighborhood began to change. Not overnight, and not without setbacks, but with the steady progress that comes when people choose to confront their biases and work toward understanding rather than fear. The evening that started with suspicion and prejudice had become the beginning of healing and hope.